Hello, folks. Welcome back to the World War II TV, and this should be good. We kick things off basically where we left them last time John was on, and we'll be looking at 1942. Who knows exactly which direction the conversation will go? It depends on what questions we get in from you guys. There's a few already lined up in the sidebar. Before I get in, bring Jon Parshall in, don't forget, of course, the link to register for his new website about his 1942 book, which is imminent, is in the description below. So make sure if you haven't already, you sign up for that. But I'll bring him in now. Good afternoon, John. How are you today?
Oh, living the dream. I mean,
living the dream.
Finally to be here with you. So, yeah.
So, 1942. I mean, it's the subject of the book, but it was the realization I had starting this channel that I was an unashamed 1944 guy living in Normandy. That's where I kind of started. I think as a kid, I was a 1940 kid because of Battle of Britain and things like that.
Sure.
But in the last 4 years, I've just realized 42 is the year where it all just changes and keeps changing. Could have swung this way, could have swung that way. And although there were events in 44 that kind of derailed the plan a little bit, they didn't really upset the whole
apple cart.
It was the end was kind of in sight by then. Even 43, you know, things are starting to get, but 42. So before we get into the questions, when you obviously Midway, your first book, Shattered Sword, was about 1942, but was 42 always your favorite child?
No, I wouldn't put it that way. I mean, my approach to book writing has always been pretty non-linear in that, the only reason Tony and I wrote Shattered Sword was because we had been involved with an undersea expedition that had found this chunk of junk down on the bottom that turned out to be wreckage from Kaga. And right. Nauticos came to us. They said, "Can you help us identify this chunk of junk?" And after doing that, we were like, "Okay, it's the Kaga. That's kind of cool." And then we were kind of like, there's never really been a book on the Japanese side of the Battle of Midway, and you and I have got access to sources that have never been used before. Maybe that's us. And I had just gotten done with illustrating and doing a lot of work on Mark Petey's Sunburst, which was all about Japanese naval aviation. And that was kind of my apprenticeship on how do you write a book. And so fast forward to 1999, and now I have this sort of arrogance enough to think, well, I could do that. I went through my apprenticeship. I can write a book. Hell yeah. And 6 years later, that turned into Shattered Sword. This book, this 1942 book, I guess is sort of an outgrowth of that, in that as I was sort of thinking in the 2 or so years after Shattered Sword came out about what I wanted to do next, I knocked around a couple of different ideas, but really what it came back to is I just felt ignorant about 1942. And I don't write books about things that I'm already up to speed on. I wanted to educate myself on this year and the structure of this year, because I was already sort of convinced that it was kind of the decisive year in the war, but I wanted to dig deeper into that and kind of and just broaden my chops a little bit. I have always seen myself, despite the fact that Shattered Sword is a deep dive. I mean, we get in the weeds, about damage control and fire control systems and all that kind of stuff. But I've always considered myself really kind of a big picture synthesis dude. And so being able to look across the scope of an entire year was sort of appealing to me. And yeah, here we are 16 years later, and there should be a book in early 2026. That's the plan.
Good. Which in history, in writing books terms, is imminent. That's like tomorrow, isn't it? I mean,
yeah, I guess so. But it's weird, to think that this project has consumed a quarter of my life.
Wow. Wow. And we talked about it last time. In the process, your conclusions will inevitably evolve because you read more articles, read more books, and that gives you a good point. And I think the key thing we talked about last time, we'll get into it today, is that we grew up in an era where historians were primarily in one sector. There was David Glantz doing the kind of the Soviet Eastern Front stuff, and then there were Pacific people. I mean, Richard Frank I would think of as primarily a Pacific person. Ian W. Toll is in that area.
Although Rich is really broad-based too, you would be surprised. But anyway,
you know what I mean? Sort of with a kind of a focus. But as people like Alan Allport and Jonathan Fennell and yourself and others, Indy and I on his channel, nothing happens in a vacuum. The Mediterranean affects the Eastern Front. The Eastern Front affects China. China affects this. And it all just kind of goes around in this big circle. So let's crack on with some questions.
Yeah, let's do some questions, baby.
I've got some there. So obviously 1942 begins particularly with the continuation of the Japanese expansion. It's just country after country, territory after territory falling to them in their kind of just massive great grab that really couldn't have gone much better for them in many ways. But a question from Jim Grundy: did the Japanese really expect the US would agree to a negotiated peace and allow them to retain their territorial gains in the first 6 months of the war? And if so, what did they base that on?
I think, okay, so there's a question of context there that needs to be explored. And I think from the perspective of the Japanese, you have to sort of put yourself in their mindset. And from where they're sitting, they have just signed up with the winning team. Because if you go all the way back to when was the Italian occupation of Abyssinia? I want to say like 1935. And since about that time, the Axis totalitarian states have reeled off basically what is an unbroken string of victories during that, 7 years worth of time. And so the Japanese also look at us, we're in the midst of the Great Depression. They view us as being a divided country. Certainly, I'll just put it out there, we're a bunch of racial mongrels, as far as the Japanese are concerned. They got this we're homogeneous, we're the Japanese people. So there's a really different mindset from their standpoint. There was certainly disagreement within their upper circles as to whether or not this strategy, if you can even call it that, was going to work or not. I think that if you were to talk to Yamamoto, if we could have dinner with him now and say, okay, Isoroku, my dude, did you really think that sinking 5 battleships was gonna do us in, and make us come to the table? He would have said pretty slim odds, but it was the best thing that I could think of at the time. I knew that if I didn't take the Pacific Fleet off the table, that fleet now represents a direct military threat to the eastern flank of my southern advance that is aiming to grab the oil and all that stuff. So I've got to eliminate that threat. And 2, there is a moral dimension here, a morale dimension, that if we can sink enough battleships, which were at the time the coin of the realm, to measure naval power, that it may be that American morale will crack at the outset, particularly in conjunction with, hopefully the British are falling apart in Malaya. We're going to, wipe the Brits or the Dutch off the map as well, yada, yada, yada. They'll just the Americans will see this unfolding catastrophe in the Pacific, and they've lost half their battle fleet at Pearl Harbor. And hopefully what they will do is turn and face their more important threat, which is the Germans. So I think that Yamamoto would have given you slim odds, but this was the best thing that he could come up with.
Well, that's a good solid start to a question there. So I'm going to try and flit around the theaters rather than just doing Pacific stuff and going around. So let's go to North Africa, because, obviously a hell of a lot happened in North Africa in 1942. Yeah. So I have a question here from Ian T. Of the battles at Alamein, which was the most important, and was the death of Gott and arrival of Monty a game changer in the Middle East?
Great questions.
Well, he's a World War II TV tour guest. So
well, there we go.
She's been well trained.
I tend to think that it is the first battle of Alamein, which is the most important, in that Egypt is up for play at this point. If Auchinleck can't stop Rommel at the gates of Egypt, this is the Alamein bottleneck, is the last sort of remaining place where we can draw a line in the sand where we can't have our flanks turned. And if we fold here, now we're talking about for one thing, Alexandria has already been, rigged for demolition charges. They were going to blow up all the harbor facilities. That was already underway even before that first battle was fought. And, you have to think that Cairo could be taken, and now the canal goes down as well. And the Suez Canal is, much like the Panama Canal, is one of these sort of non-negotiable geo positions that the British Empire just has to retain. it's clear too that if you look at Auchinleck's recollections of the matter, I mean, he was prepared, even if beaten at Alamein, to continue, keeping his army in being and doing a fighting retreat all the way into Palestine if need be. But I just think, again, looking at the political dimension too, if Egypt goes down the tubes now, Churchill is toast. It's over for him.
Yeah.
He survives handily a vote of no confidence in July of 1942, but I don't think that vote would have gone that way if Alamein had gone down the drink and Cairo was captured next week. That's not going to get it done. So for my money, it's the first battle that is the important one. Okay, death of Gott. I think Gott was a good commander. I think Gott was an exhausted good commander, and I'm not sure that Gott had the energy that was necessary to get Eighth Army to believe in itself again. I'm not a huge Montgomery fan. I think he's got a lot of flaws as a human being. I don't think he's very good when it comes to combined arms. And actually, I think Auchinleck had a much better sense for how the Eighth Army needed to be rebuilt to be more effective in combined armed operations against the Germans than Montgomery did. However, Auchinleck was not as effective in imposing his will on that army and making it conform to the commander's vision. Montgomery was great at that. He was electrifying in terms of his physical presence, which is weird because he's this weird little scrawny guy, but he has this just kind of this vibrancy about him. He is tremendously forceful. He's a good trainer. And he is benefiting from the fact that there's a lot of American aid coming into the pipeline at this point. He was placed in what is a desperate but also fortuitous position in that he inherits a lot of good things that were already kind of in the pipeline, and uses them effectively and goes forth to victory. So I think that Monty has to be given reasonably high marks for his subsequent third battle at Alamein that goes very well.
Thank you for that. And I think I want to add something to that, which is, I think we collectively have this, when we look at battles and a series of battles in the same location, and it kind of goes maybe defeat, victory. We think of that turning point, and we agree we don't like the turning point.
Yeah, we both are in that camp. Yeah.
The last one that we lost is a loss, and therefore the next one is important because it's the victory. But I think, and I'm using Normandy's example, which is a bad example because we're talking about 1942, that actually the last battle you lose can actually be the pivotal one, because it's the one where you've maybe identified your mistakes, and it's, you have it in sport where a team has still lost, but they've turned the corner. They've got the new coach in, they've got their new tactic, and then the next time they play, the following Saturday, they win where they lost the week before. And I think this kind of binary way we look at it of, oh, well, they lost that one. I think Operation Goodwood is the good example of that in Normandy. Of, yes, theoretically it's a German victory, but I don't. It's beginning to change things. I think you get that in the desert. I think you get that with first and second Alamein, is that that there's a shift, even sometimes though the victory isn't quite there. It's changed things. Would you agree with that in principle?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can see some things in the first two battles there that are already sort of presaging that victory. We talked about this on that earlier talk around Alamein. Yeah. The maturation of British artillery under Sidney Kirkman is just, holy Moses, it is now a really, really lethal force. The arrival of American armor, I mean, even the Grant was probably a better battlefield tank than pretty much anything out there except the Mark IV F2. So, there's, and the increasing introduction of 6-pounder AT guns into not only British armored vehicles, but I think more importantly into their infantry battalions meant that there's a lot more organic firepower that's now coming into this force. So as usual, I don't think it's good to point at one single thing and say, this is the thing. I'm a guy who likes nuance and complexity, and I look at there's a whole bunch of little factors that all are coming together. And as much as I hate the word synergistic, because I have an MBA and I spent way too much time in the business world, nevertheless, those things did come together for a really nice package of capabilities for the British by the time we get to the third battle. I'm going to cherry pick here. and scoop in on Samuel Thompson's. Did the IGN have a homing beacon radio system to recover carrier-borne aircraft? No. Boom, done. There you go.
Okay, that we can cross that one off this. Thank you, Sam, for that. I mean, I love it. I love the idea that 1942 is where we said that the trend can be changing, even though the results aren't quite there.
Yes.
That's kind of the key of 1942.
Absolutely.
It's like that whole thing about a ship just can't turn on a sixpence. It's begun its turn, but you're still thinking it's going forwards. But it has the rudder has turned, and it is actually turning around now. But we've got a pile of questions. So let's do. So, Mad Cat, why has Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher not got the recognition for his role in World War II?
I think that Fletcher is getting increasing recognition for that, and I would credit that to John Lundstrom's book, Black Shoe Carrier Admiral, which came out in 2006, right after Shattered Sword did. And so I think Fletcher's reputation is gradually being rehabilitated, but this is one of those multi-year kind of things where it's going to take more books being written that sort of acknowledge that fact. I don't know that Fletcher will be seen as, kind of an electrifying performer in the way that you look at some other people like Jocko Clark or somebody like that has a real affinity for the weapon system. But for my money, Fletcher fought 3 carrier battles. He won all 3 of them, including the 2 most important of that year, Coral Sea and Midway. He sank 6 Japanese carriers in the process of winning those victories while losing only 2 of his own. If that's not a solid performance, I don't know what is.
If you were doing his PR, his website, you've got the PR line down to a T there. Yeah, exactly. On that alone, he sounds fantastic. Yeah. 3
wins, 6 for 2. Boom.
Yeah, boom. Yeah. Well, this is more of a comment from Don, but is this all just a riff on the Douglas Adams running gag about 42 being the answer to life, the universe, and everything? I'm on board if it is, and yes, I think we are all on board. 42.
Yeah.
In a double whammy is the answer to everything. It is the answer to World War II.
It's the answer to everything.
Yeah, that's a great comment there. We've had people asking about Madagascar and Vichy and French Pacific colonies. So kind of let's do that. So to get Representative Sway the questions, Scott Bremen, what was the value of the French Pacific Islands colonies to the Allies in 1942? And David O'Keefe is asking about Madagascar, which also has that whole French connection. So
let's do Madagascar first, because that to me is just, I think that was, in retrospect, it's clearly completely unnecessary. There was no way that the Japanese were going to go there in any sort of strength, although there were some, submarines that they sent across at roughly that time. So I look at the Madagascar operation in retrospect as being a tremendous waste of material and resources, because among other things, what ends up happening is you're pulling a significant number of home fleet units out of the North Atlantic, and you're asking the Americans to cover the bill while you're out doing that, right? So you've got Washington and Wasp sitting up in Scapa Flow. Wasp is occasionally running Spitfires down to Malta, and you can imagine what Admiral King thinks about all of this too, particularly fast forward when American forces are involved with the PQ-17 disaster in July. I mean, a lot of the American heavy units are going to end up being pulled out of the Atlantic and sent over to the Pacific after that. But this also ties in, I think, to the traditional British critique of Admiral King's response to Paukenschlag, the slaughter of merchantmen off the East Coast by Donitz's U-boats. And there's a consistent failure, I think, to account for all of the demands that were being put on American naval resources during this time. We've got to, escort these incredibly important troop convoys over to the UK to put American troops into Britain, because lo and behold, the British are shipping their own divisions out, like the 18th Infantry Division, it's going to end up in Singapore. So we're doing these troop convoys. We've got to protect those convoys massively, because King understands that losing a regiment of American boys drowned in one stroke is, a PR disaster. So I'm going to escort those convoys within an inch of my life. And, so we got that going on. And now we're also covering up in Scapa Flow in case Tirpitz gets uppity. So we've got heavy units up there as well, so that y'all can go down to Madagascar and capture that place. You know, this is the nature of coalition warfare, and your partners have to cover for you while you're doing things. But I think that it would be nice from an interpretational standpoint if the British would acknowledge that, in fact, they had created a whole bunch of demands for King that he was in difficulty to cover somewhat because of what they're doing to us. All right. French Pacific Islands, New Caledonia, gotta have it, you know. And it's funny, too, when you read through the Gray Book, which is the Pacific Fleet running intelligence summary that's got all of the message traffic back and forth between King and Nimitz and Gormley down in the South Pacific, it's fascinating, the first 8 months or so, just how much signal traffic is going back and forth about the French and how difficult the French are to deal with. And because you got Vichy French holdings, you got Free French holdings, and, you know, sometimes they'll send ships over and try to take an island back from each other. It's a hot mess. But just for the primacy of New Caledonia and the port of Noumea in the Guadalcanal campaign as a whole, I think you have to say that that one island alone was worth its weight in gold in 1942, just because it gives us the advanced base that we need to initiate the most important campaign in the Pacific during that entire year.
Okay, good answer. And I know someone who's writing a book about Madagascar, but I can't say who it is. But I do, but I'm not going to say who it is. But it's going to be
cherry pick. Stuart Burbridge. Was Nimitz the finest American commander of the entire war? I wouldn't necessarily say that, but I would say that he is the finest naval officer that this country has ever produced. Boom.
Yeah.
Done.
Well, I love a nice quick one. I've saved that one. This is my favorite question. There's lots of really good ones coming in, but I think it ties into something I've brought up on the channel a few times before with guests. And David Levine is saying, with all of the many Allied defeats during 1942, how close did the Allied morale come to cracking? Was it ever a possibility? Because can we go in just that one there? What's your first reaction?
I do think it was possible that it could have cracked that. And let me now pivot to the Eastern Front.
Yep.
I think if you look at, and this is something that I say in my book, which is sort of an unusual interpretation, but when I look at order number 227, which is the famous not a step back order, most people look at that as being this sort of wake-up call to the Red Army to put some steel in their spines, you know, at the point of a gun, obviously, and get them to perform better. And I think that interpretationally that is true, but there is another dimension that is very important that often gets overlooked. If you read the text of how Stalin frames that order, it is all in economic terms. He talks about bread, about factories, about farm fields, about metal. In fact, the word bread crops up like in 10 different places throughout this 3 or 4 page order. I mean, the realization that Stalin has had is, look, the card we played in 1941 was we traded away 40% of our population and 25% of our GDP in order to buy the time to, you know, retreat in front of the Wehrmacht and hopefully rebuild our army. We cannot play that card again, or we're not going to have a country left, right? So I think that there is an underlying realization on the part of Stalin that our economy is on a knife's edge just at this point. The Soviet people are starving, okay? There's widespread food hardships going on. They're being worked to death in these factories. The housing situation is crappy. If you look at the amount of GDP that is being devoted to consumer spending, which we kind of look at today, oh, consumer spending, you know, it's like cans of soda pop and lamps and kind of stuff. It was down by 37% in 1942. And in an already very poor population, what that means is a lot less food going into people's stomachs, no building materials for housing. You got people living in hallways and basements and bathrooms. I mean, it's a shit show. It's terrible. So combine the wording of 227 with what we also know is going on in terms of food hardship and that kind of thing. And then the third element that I would bring out is if you look at the rate of extrajudicial killings within the Soviet Union, of course, during the Great Terror of 37 and 38, boom, get this huge spike, right? And it burbles back down to about like 39 and 40. And yeah, there's still, stuff going on there. They're still killing people. There's another big spike, not to the levels of 37 or 38, but there's a noticeable spike in 1942. And my argument is that Stalin doesn't repress for fun. Stalin represses when he is scared and angry about the way things are going. And I look at all of those things together and I say, the Soviets are repressing like hell because they got to keep the lid on this thing. It doesn't take long for this country to fold. This country had already folded back in World War I under economic circumstances that were much less dire. And so, I think that the Soviet Union was on the knife's edge. We will never know how close it came. We will never properly understand the impact of lend-lease on that equation, although I think it was profound. But yeah, I think the Soviet Union was teetering. And you can still see that by fast forwarding to 43 when they're putting out feelers for a separate peace.
Well, brilliant response, and I think it ties in with something where I can't try and find the question now. It's in there. Peter O'Connell said, "What the timeline of Soviet reconstruction of their armament factories beyond the Urals and the stiffing of the defense of Stalingrad." We've talked about that on the channel with Wendy Goldman and others. That incredible effort to move all the factories, and it's not a battle. It's not an operation. It is an operation, I suppose, but it's something that is happening in this era that is really, really important to the outcome of battles later on, isn't it?
Yeah, and actually, in the case of the Soviets, there's almost a two-phase move in that some of the components that ended up being moved during 41 ended up in places like Stalingrad, and then they have to be moved out again. Although obviously the Dzerzhinsky factory was still making T-34s and then repairing them as well. So that movement of material and factories is something that I definitely talk about in the course of this book, because the resurrection of the Soviet armaments industry is obviously crucial to their performance during the year as a whole. And so there was a really good book written by a Swedish guy, and I'm spacing his name now, on Tankograd, and I bring that in as a source just to look at what's going on in the town of Chelyabinsk at this time. Because the truth of the matter is that all of this material, these components from various factories, they're dragging stuff out from Leningrad and what have you, just gets kind of dumped on railroad sidings, along with the workers and their families for whom no housing is available, and they've got to cobble all that stuff together and still, crank out tanks. And so in many cases, they're setting up the machine tools in open air locations. They're getting snow on them to start with until they can actually build the expanded facilities at the tractor factory that was already there. I mean, it's a hot mess. And again, though, it really illustrates this different sense of the Soviet Union that I think we tend to look at the Soviets as being this sort of wooden, unresponsive, military and economy. And in actuality, during this year, they are phenomenally adaptable and end up resurrecting not only their economy, but also completely transforming the Red Army in the process.
Brilliant response. Well, in reference to what you said about morale and David's last question, Brian Cummings is saying someone thought that morale was close to cracking, the Doolittle raid was authorized and didn't have any strategic importance. And 42, well, we'll let you respond to that specifically, but 42 is kind of the year of particularly the British commando raids, kind of for the sake of commando raids. And I'm not in any way criticizing the incredible volunteers who signed up for all these incredibly these new organized commandos and SBS and SAS and small raiding force and stuff. But you have to consider 80 years on, some of them were a bit odd. But they had this.
Hello,
was
Dieppe.
there a conscious effort in 42 to just get things under our belt that are victories, even if they aren't necessarily particularly important to the grand scheme of things?
Yeah, no, I think this is absolutely right, and that we, from 80 years removed, have the luxury of sitting in our, our easy chairs reading our books, and we don't have the sense of immediacy about just how freaking bleak things looked in the first half of this year. It was ugly. And I have to say it particularly for the British. By the time, you get to things like the Channel Dash in February of 42, it's just the absolute nadir of British fortunes. And it's going to keep going all the way to this, this terrible retreat from Gazala that's going to wind up in Alamein. It's a dumpster fire. And so I think you're absolutely right that some of these commando raids from the British were absolutely put together just to say, we're still in it. We're still in it. We're plucky. We're continuing to fight. And Doolittle raid is absolutely the same breed of cat. There's no question that its initial conception, which came from FDR, was, I just need you to poke the Japanese in the eye somehow and just let them know this ain't over, Bubba. We are still in this thing. And by the way, we hate you. And, it ain't over until it's over. That raid had a massive effect on American public morale. It was a real lifter-upper in what was a terribly dark time for us. And it does end up having a fairly important strategic effect in terms of the Japanese as well. No, it was not the genesis of the Midway operation. That operation had already been in the works, and in fact, Yamamoto had won the bureaucratic battle to secure approval to do that operation. That happened on April 4th. Doolittle doesn't happen until April 18th. But what it does is it cements Yamamoto's political position within the Japanese military as a whole, because up until this point, the Japanese army is like, we ain't playing with this Midway thing, because we know, Navy, that you guys are actually secretly trying to work your way down the Hawaiian island chain and end up in Oahu, and we don't want to invade Oahu. We think that's stupid. The Army does a complete 180 after the Doolittle raid. Within a couple of weeks, the Army comes back to the Navy and like, you know what? We're going to kick in a regiment of troops for this Midway landing force. So here's Colonel Ichi or Ichiki/Iki. That he's got two different pronunciations of his name. That's the cat who's going to end up being slaughtered down in Guadalcanal in a couple months. The other thing the Army says is not only that, we are going to cut orders to two of our divisions to start amphibious training for the invasion of Oahu. So that's a real sea change as far as the Imperial Army is concerned.
Brilliant stuff. And I think the Allies are proving that there are concepts that are still really in their infancy in 42, but that will be developed. I mean, just the whole flinging medium bombers off carriers, the fact that we can parachute people behind the lines. Yeah, they may not do much when they get there, although we can debate that. But we can appear wherever you're least expecting it. We can now appear. We can appear by canoe or converted old merchant ship or Japanese junk or from the air or sea, and we will hit you. And that, I think, is something that would have alarmed the Axis generally.
I wanted to circle back to a point. I'm kind of watching the comments going by here, and just in terms of relative hardships on these various fronts. I hate to say it, but the British and the Americans don't even have a candle to hold to what the Soviet people go through. It's not even in the same ballpark in terms of deprivation. We, up here in Minneapolis, we have this World War II history roundtable, and we bring in historians, and in many cases, we used to bring in a lot of veterans. We actually have a fairly large Russian population in the Twin Cities, and one of these roundtables where we had Jonathan House coming in to give a talk, we had about 10 different Red Army veterans, men and women, getting up on the stage to tell some of their stories. And it was interesting because they were completely uncontainable, and it just turned into this sort of Russian madhouse. It was kind of crazy. But there was a story there that has always stuck with me. One of these guys was a stevedore up in Murmansk. This American transport comes into Murmansk, and they start unloading all the pallets worth of stuff. And this American sailor gets off the ship, goes to one of these crates, opens it up, gets out this can of something, and tries handing it to this Russian. And the Russian's like, well, I can't take this. American opens the can, gets out his penknife, cuts off, a bite of this food, whatever is in there, eats it to show him, hey, it ain't poison, baby. Here you go. Hands the can. And of course, what is it? It's Spam. And this veteran, this Russian, was the most delicious thing I've ever eaten. And I knew then that we would not starve. This is in probably early 43. So again, just the level of deprivation when you are, when a can of Spam is like, this is manna from heaven, high caloric, lots of fat. I mean, this was big news, and we shipped billions of cans of Spam and Tushonkas to the Soviet Union, to the point that at the height of lend-lease aid, we're providing every man and woman in the Red Army with about a half a pound of food a day, and really high caloric stuff. This ain't cabbage we're shipping here. This is protein and stuff. Anyway,
that connects with the industrialization of logistics generally. The fact that we could shrink wrap biscuits and candy and tin stuff and put it in these wax boxes, and the revolution of rations. I mean, every veteran you ever meet talks about how shit K rations were and the British 24-hour rations, and don't ever eat the chocolate, it doesn't melt at the right temperature, all that kind of stuff. But bloody hell, it was an amazing improvement if you go back to the First World War of what people were eating then. So that was a massive revolution in 42 and World War II generally, of just how we could get food to troops. And as you say, they're not just troops, but the people around the world were starving. And rationing, and what rationing means, it all depends on where you are.
Where you were. Just doing some real-time history for you here, in my manuscript. And so we shipped a grand total of 4.4 million tons of food, including 1 million tons of wheat, and more than 2 billion American-made cans of Spam and Russian-style tinned beef. They were christened second fronts by the Russian soldiers, sarcastically so, but of course, they wolfed them down all the same. So anyway, I
mean, some of those figures are they're mind blowing. Even crazy. Today. So, we'll go at some kind of quicker, easier ones. There were Mad Cat saying would Jon talk about the design of the USS Wasp and why it was sunk?
Wasp was an attempt to get a lot more flight deck on a smaller displacement, because we were running out of tonnage under the naval treaties and really didn't have enough to play with to come out with a full-size carrier. And, do I think that probably manifests itself in why it was sunk? Yeah, kind of. But the Japanese had really good torpedoes too. I mean, they clobbered her. She's a little ship. I can't remember how many they hit her with. It was 2 or 3, and down she goes. It is arguable if even a Yorktown class carrier would have survived that number of hits. So,
we can't talk about 1942 without talking about amphibious landings, both ETO, Pacific, all over the place. There's one question was in really early on, and
actually,
sorry,
I'm going to interrupt just briefly. Somebody said 3 long lances will do it. These were not long lances. Long lance was only mounted by surface units. The Type 95 torpedo that was carried by their submarines is sort of a miniaturized version of the long lance, but it ain't as big, and it doesn't have the range, and it doesn't have the size of warhead. It's a great torpedo, don't get me wrong, but it is not in the same league as the big boy, which is carried by Japanese destroyers and cruisers. Point of order. Thank you. Go back to it. Yes.
So David O'Keefe, author of the best book on Dieppe. So James Hall is asking, other than the don't attack ports directly, what does Jon think was the most important lesson the Allies learned from Operation Jubilee, the attack on Dieppe? So we're not going to go down the rabbit hole of it being a pinch raid. I think it was. Some people don't think it was. But anyway, being clear that it wasn't just to learn stuff. I mean, we're not going to say that's the only reason for it, but nevertheless, you do learn from things that go wrong. What do you think is the biggest thing we learned from Dieppe?
Firepower, baby. I mean, if
baby.
Lucian Truscott comes away from that operation having been an observer aboard a British warship and watching this, fustercluck unfold. And yeah, I think there's just a realization on the part of the Allies that, okay, you know, if you're serious about coming in against the, you know, the West Wall, or excuse me, the beach, the Atlantic Wall,
Yeah.
we got to have firepower out the yin yang, aircraft, naval gunnery. You got to bring it, specialized equipment, the whole shebang. You can't go mincing around and saying, well, we're not going to bomb the town because we're scared about, you know, I get it that in the context of a raid, you don't want to kill thousands of French civilians. But if you're serious about, you know, actually getting ashore at one of these locations and staying, you got to bring it. And that would be my lesson. Yeah, better reconnaissance, way better preparatory fires. That's how you do things.
I mean, I think even, you know, we're sticking with 42, but I think even in 45, no one's ever writing, you know what, we hit that place with too much stuff. No one ever says that. It's always, we could have hit it a bit more. I mean, however much you send, however many bombs you drop, shells you fire, a bit more would always have been better, I suppose.
Yeah, right. And I'm very much in the camp that, you know, Mountbatten was just full of malarkey when he was, oh, it's the precious secret of victory. That's a bunch of tripe. You know,
well, Mountbatten is not on my list of favorite commanders in World War II. He's nowhere near. Quick one from Andreas there. Well, I think it's a quick one. Can Jon speak about the progress of Manhattan Project in 42? Because again, it's lots of stuff going on behind the scenes in 42 that we don't really see the impact of until 2 or 3 years later.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting because I actually, what date I write about this? Boop, 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 boop. Okay, so it was 2nd December 1942 when Fermi and his crew underneath the stadium at University of Chicago fire up the first fusion pile that is, you know, able to sustain its own reaction. That's a first in history. Basically, what ends up happening in 1942, in a nutshell, is that FDR wakes up to the threat that a German bomb program might represent to the U.S. and to the Allies more broadly. Also realizes that the British are ahead of us at this point in terms of their own programs, but they just don't have the industrial resources to throw at it. Leslie Groves is going to end up taking over this thing. Once the president kind of gives the word that, okay, we're in, you know, let's go. I can't remember the name of Groves's predecessor. It was actually Groves' boss, but he was not a fire breather. But March or April, something like that, we end up putting Groves in charge, and Groves is just a bulldozer. And I think one of his most important realizations is that time is everything. And I don't have the luxury, if I don't have a clear-cut engineering solution for problem X, I'm going to bet on 3 different solutions to it. I'm going to pour resources into all of them because time is the most precious resource that I have. He goes out, he buys huge tracts of land, pardon the pun, you know, starts building factories on them immediately. I mean, this dude built the Pentagon in a year, right? So he's the right kind of cat to just, you know, he's a total son of a bitch, don't get me wrong, but he was incredibly good at getting things done. And so by the time, you know, fast forward to December 2nd, you know, already this industrial process is unfolding in the U.S. that is going to result in the bomb. I think that, too, there's always sort of a temptation to overplay how dangerous the German bomb program was. Right. I just, no. Even if they had gotten the science right, which they weren't, the bottom line
way off, weren't they? They were way off, years off.
But there's this unrealistic view of what the Manhattan Project was, in that people look at cats like Oppenheimer and they're like, well, it was because of the brilliance of American and British scientists that, you know, we had this brilliant team. It's like, brilliance had nothing to do with it.
Money.
It's money and industrial capacity. If you look at the budget of the Manhattan Project, 90% of that money is going towards building factories to refine the shit that you need, you know, to get this thing put together. So the scale of the bomb project is on the order of $2.2 billion. The biggest German weapons program is the V2. They only spend there's some stupid estimates out there which are wrong, but for my money, probably about $500 million is all the Germans were able to spend on the V2. There is no way in hell that the Germans, even if they had gotten the science right, would they have had the industrial wolf, let alone sources of uranium, to put together a bomb. So
I heard someone describe compare the two atomic programs with the Germans are effectively taking it to a little guy with a welder and an anvil in a market to get theirs, whereas the Americans take theirs to a industrialized Ford plant. And I think that kind of sums it up, really.
Well, and what ends up happening, of course, in the German program this same year, sometime in the summer, is that the Germans are like, if we're not going to get quick results from this thing, we're out of here. You know, we've got to focus our resources on more immediately available military options, because we need more tanks at this point. Is kind of what it comes down to, an aircraft. So.
Well, the one thing we haven't mentioned that I think is key to 1942 is the Battle of the Atlantic. We haven't mentioned U-boats. We haven't mentioned the changing of the code. So a representative question, Elias there. 42 was also a big year for the Germans in the Atlantic battle. They broke the main code. The Allied convoys came up with a new code for their submarines and had their second happy time. Now, one of the things that has divided World War II TV guest historians is not the importance of the Battle of the Atlantic. Everyone agrees it's really, really important, but whether or not it was really ever in doubt. You know, that Alan Allport particularly is of that, know what, Britain was never really close to running out of stuff. More convoys were getting through than weren't getting through. But the perception, definitely, if David O'Keefe was part of the chat, the perception in the Houses of Commons and the Parliament and what have you is that the North Battle Atlantic is really, really where it can fall apart. So the Jon Parshall opinion of the Battle of Atlantic in 42, please.
Again, I broadly speaking, I think if you look at the situation in the Atlantic by the end of 42, ex post facto, you can go back through those tea leaves and you can see that, broadly speaking, we've got this thing under control now. Yeah. The fact that, let me wind back. I look at Operation Paukenschlag as a tacit admission on the part of Dönitz that he is losing the battle on the North Atlantic convoy routes to the Royal and Canadian Navies at this point. And what he's looking for here is an opportunity to spread the field and move into areas where the defenses are less well prepared. And man, they were really unprepared off the East Coast. And he does that very successfully for about 6 or 7 months. And then eventually, our defenses coalesce sufficiently that he's not getting the returns that he's looking for. And now, starting in about August, they reconsolidate on the northern convoy lines again, and it's game on. And that's all of a sudden where suddenly everybody gets this perception that, this black pit thing is really rather annoying, that we've got to spend 3 or 4 days in this thing, and a lot of bad things can happen here in 3 or 4 days. Fast forwarding to December of 42, I think broadly speaking, you can look back at it in hindsight. You can say, we've realized the importance of VLR aircraft, although I have a ton of things to say about the VLR lib and the fact that, again, I hate to point fingers, but the British are like, we couldn't get any more VLR libs out of Admiral King. Well, first of all, VLR libs is an Army Air Force bomber. If you want libs, don't go talking to King, go talk to Hap Arnold and try to pry them out of his dead hands. Second, y'all have a pretty damn good aircraft industry of your own. And if you wanted your own VLR planes, there were talks in hand to actually take the Sterling, which certainly was not a very effective platform over Europe, had an average lifespan of like 11 sorties or something hideous like that. Turn that puppy into a VLR plane. Yes, because of the wing design of the B-24, the Sterling conversion would not have had the same range as a VLR lib, but it's a big ass plane. You can put a lot of fuel tanks in. There's no rocket science here. You strip all the armor, you take off the guns, you stuff a fuel tank in one of the bomb bays, you stuff a radar on this thing, voila, you got a VLR plane. So the British absolutely could have produced that own asset for themselves if they were willing to go through the trouble and thumb wrestle with Bomber Harris, which admittedly is daunting, but but the technology was there. And actually, not even the British in many cases recognized that the black pit was going to be a problem until about October of the year, when it's suddenly like, yeah, our losses here are just really bad. So anyway, that's a whole complex answer. So the tea leaves, I think, would tell you that even by December of 42, broadly speaking, we've got this thing in hand, but it sure wasn't obvious at the time. And again, we have to always place ourselves in the context of the decision makers based on the information that they had to them and what were their perceptions. People were flipping out because they're looking at German U-boat production. Donitz is going to have, potentially 300, 400, 500 boats under commission. Holy crap. How are we going to fight that? So, the fact that breaking the German U-boat force is sort of at the top of the bill for the Casablanca Conference gives you an indication as just how important Allied political and military leaders viewed that threat.
Brilliant. David O'Keefe has put a couple of comments in the sidebar. Whether it was or wasn't his secondaries, historically, what was important was that the perception that it was in doubt was very real. And he added,
Yes.
The other thing that was key was the sinking of oil tankers. Oil tankers was off the chart compared to other types of craft. That's what created the perception of urgency and crisis, not the overall numbers.
Perfect comments.
Perfect.
Yeah.
And Stuart Burbridge is adding, Mark Milner called it the crisis that never was.
Fascinating. Yeah. Yes, perception is important here too. And I do very much agree with David that the importance of tankers, if I have to give King a letter grade for Paukenschlag, and this is very much contrary to the standard British interpretation. Yeah, you got the finger point, my dude. I give him a B+, maybe even an A-. The ding I would put on him is that we could have gotten tanker-only convoying probably going sooner than we otherwise did. That it would have made sense to form the bucket brigades even just for tanker-only assets. You probably could have done that maybe in April. Yeah. So, that is problematic. But again, I think that there's a tendency on the part of a lot of these sort of, sensationalist accounts that are out there. Gannon's, Operation Drumbeat, which I think is just far too narrowly focused on what is going just down on the East Coast. It's like King has got a worldwide war to manage. Yeah. And again, there's this whole list of other naval requirements, some of which are being foisted on him by the British, that he's got to accommodate. And the result is a hell of a lot of scrambling on the part of the Americans and a lot of merchant ships lost off the East Coast. I absolutely acknowledge that it was bad, but given what we had to fight with, I think generally King did about as good a job as he could have.
Brilliant. Great question earlier. You referenced how, the Soviets really suffering. We talked about people's perception of rationing generally being depending on where you are. It's a good question which I'm going to expand on, Mr. Frickenfracken. Even with the collective anger after Pearl Harbor, did it take the rationing program started in 1942 to really get the US populace to buy into the war? Because the US always had that kind of distance from everything, because even Pearl Harbor was way out, away from the heartland. Whereas if you're in Britain, okay, the phony war period that never was a phony war, but your bombs are literally landing in most British cities. If you're in Poland, if you're in Czechoslovakia, if you're in France, the war is right there on your doorstep early on. So 42 was when all the things, the saving of paper for the war efforts, the war bonds. Do you think it's that initiative that really was? Do you agree with Frickenfracken's question?
If that really is his name.
If his really name, yeah. It's a great name. He does it, so I have to say it, keep saying it again. But yeah.
Well, Herr Frickenfracken. I would say again that there's an accumulation of different things that are coming into focus. I mean, Pearl Harbor right then and there, the fact that you killed 2,300 American boys in the course of a morning, people are pissed. And there's a very real and visceral anger against the Japanese at that point. But I would tend to agree that it's, this is accumulation of other factors, particularly on the East Coast, that start really bringing the fact that, okay, there is in fact a war going on here. We've got corpses of merchant mariners washing up on the beaches on Long Island.
Yeah.
You know, they're asking us to turn off our lights for goodness sake, you know, on our coastline cities. And then, gas rationing gets put in place, rubber rationing, sugar, because we're now feeding Britain. We're starting to gear up to feed a fair chunk of the Soviet Union as well. And so all of a sudden, you've got scarcity in the U.S. that it is not accustomed to seeing. And that, I think, did bring home to the American people that, there is war on here.
Brilliant. We're going back to Doolittle Raid and a little event called Coral Sea that I believe you might be familiar with. So Robert is saying, if the Doolittle Raid did not happen, would Nimitz have sent 3 or 4 carriers to the Coral Sea instead of just 2?
Absolutely. He already was just itching to fight a battle down in southern waters, because again, any threat to Australia at that point, which was seen as, that was going to be the big base that we were going to use to launch counteroffensives into places like Java and Borneo, that's the launch pad for all that stuff. And by March of 1942, the Australians have explicitly come to us and said, the mother country can't save us. We're in deep doo-doo. We look to America as, the guarantors of our security, which just must have been a stunning blow to Winston Churchill. I mean, talk about humiliating. But by that time, of course, Singapore has gone down into the dark. All of the southern Malay barrier is falling apart. And so the Australians are kind of supplicants at that point. And we're cutting a deal with them where we say, okay, look, we know you're bringing home 6th and 7th AIF, but we really want you to keep 9th Division there in the Middle East because, Auchinleck needs them. So what we'll do is we will send 2 American divisions down to Australia to take its place so that, we will protect you against the Japanese invasion. But the bottom line is then that from the U.S. Navy's standpoint, protecting any supply lines that go into Australia and protecting Australia itself are super important tasks that must be accomplished. And Nimitz, for his part, he just wants a carrier battle. He wants to bring the Japanese to battle. And if they're going to be operating down in those waters, even though those are waters that we had never planned to fight in, by God, I'm going down there. That was a really important bellwether in the King-Nimitz relationship as well, in that there was a conference at the end of April where King shows up, King and Nimitz both roll into San Francisco. And Nimitz is like, I want to go down to the Coral Sea and fight a big old carrier battle down there. And up until this point, King looks at Nimitz as kind of a paper pusher. This is a guy who ran the personnel bureau, really. And he's kind of like, I don't think Nimitz is the right guy for the job. This is a real eye-opener on his part, that this dude's more aggressive than I thought. He does not give Nimitz the go-ahead to do that battle right off the bat. But by the time Nimitz gets back to Pearl Harbor, the okie dokie is waiting in his inbox. And absolutely, if he had 3 or 4 carriers to send down there, he would have sent them all.
I'm glad you mentioned Australia, and thanks for the response, by the way, because I remember with the Australian historiography back in the kind of 50s and 60s, when people were writing very much from they don't like the Brits point of view, still kind of hanging off from Gallipoli and things like that. It was, why the hell is Australia sending troops to the Mediterranean and to North Africa? So, we're not protecting Australian interests. But I think the recent generation of Australian and New Zealand historians has been much more, no, we are absolutely protecting our interests, because it's all about shipping. It's all about that whole massive, great octopus tentacles of shipping routes across the globe. And if Australia, you are defending Australia by defending the Suez Canal and the Gibraltar Strait, things like that. So I think it's all one big hole. It all connects.
I just saw this. Can I
Yes, please.
cherry pick one here?
Yeah.
I just saw this comment from Historical Review. Looked at the tank strengths for the Soviet tank brigades that participated in the Second Kharkov. Yeah, there are pictures of knocked out Valentines at the Battle of Kharkov. I mean, so yes, there were a significant number of British tanks there, and just again the importance of lend-lease.
Yeah,
It's not necessarily the total quantity of material. It is when did that material actually reach the Soviet Union? And one of the things that's less well known is that the British end up sending a number of lend-lease Valentines and Matildas over to the Soviet Union right before the Battle of Moscow. So there's an appreciable number of British tanks in that battle as well. And of course, the Soviets poo-poo their contribution because, well, they weren't nearly as good as T-34s, and that is absolutely true. However, if you look at the breakdown of the number of tanks that were there, T-34s were in a tremendous minority. A lot of the Soviet armor that was there was their light tanks. You know, it was like BT-26s and, you know, T-50s and T-60s and crap like that. And frankly, a Valentine is a hell of a lot better tank than that. So, and then fast forward to Kharkov, yes, there's still a serious number of British tanks in the Soviet park. That is going to be augmented later in the summer by significant numbers of grants as well. I think that overall, Allied armor in 1942 accounts for roughly 15% of their tank park. That's nothing to sneeze at. You know, that's not necessarily war winning, but that's a big deal that, you know, that number of Allied tanks were actually in the Soviet tank park. So I just wanted to address that. Hit me with the next one.
Well, I just wanted to make the point we talked about before going live that, you know, I knew we'd get into these wonderful questions and they've been brilliant. There's lots more to come about battles and carrier designing, but there are a couple of things that happened in 42 that I think we just need to reference, even if we don't dwell on them. I think one of the things I want to mention is January the 1st, 42 was the declaration by United Nations signed by China, UK, USA, Soviet Union, and 22 other nations in which they agree not to make any separate peace with the Axis powers. And I think that's something that all goes on towards all the conferences that happen later. And I think we have to acknowledge that the Wannsee conference happened in January. The Nazis crank up their whole horrors of the Holocaust. In April, you start to get the real establishment of death camps and things like that. And I think, although I don't want to go be Captain Buzzkill and talk about the horrors of the war, but I think I do want to remind ourselves that things happened in 42 that had far-reaching effects on loss of life and all that aspect. So I do want to be a bit mention that before we go back to some questions.
Yeah, no, I think those are all good points. I actually even go back to FDR's address on December 8th when he's in front of Congress asking for a declaration of war, that the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory. Right there, I think, is a presaging of not only no separate peace, but unconditional surrender. Certainly with respect to the Japanese, we are going to crush you. We're going to crush you. We're going to win this war. We are going to dictate the terms whereby this war ends. You don't have any say in the matter. You know, he's directly forecasting that, at least as far as the Japanese are concerned. And then it's going to be put in place at Casablanca for everybody. All y'all get to surrender unconditionally.
Yeah, I think that's a key thing. That I suppose that's 41 to 42. 1940, there's still a sense that maybe this war can pan itself out in a kind of a chivalrous, old-fashioned kind of way with treaties and deals and things. But certainly by 42, the gloves are off and the knuckle dusters are out on the Allied side, and it's not going to go back now.
Right, and you can see that manifested in things like, you know, the area bombing directive that comes out in February of 42, and then of course Arthur Harris taking over bomber command, the 1,000-plane raid against Cologne. I mean, those are eye openers, and still very controversial eye openers even today. You know, again, with the luxury of hindsight. Sitting at 80 years removed, we look at something like the raids against Cologne and I'm just like, are you kidding me? You know, that's immoral and a war crime and yada, yada, yada. And it's like, well, Immoral, yes. War crime, hard to say, because the bottom line is that the British could only be as moral about their bombing as their technology and weather conditions will allow them to be. And it was absolutely imperative to hit back against the Nazis. There's just no helping it. So anyhow, yeah, for what's that worth?
Brilliant stuff. There's questions still piling up there. I'm going scattergun approach. We're going to go across the theatre. So Trevor Sheehan, Mr. Tunisia and Africa and Stalingrad is saying, was the decision to do Operation Torch inevitable?
I don't think so. I mean, posit a world in which Marshall gets his way with the British and they actually accede to an invasion of Northern Europe during 1942. That's what Marshall wanted, right? So, no, I don't think it was inevitable, but I do think it was the right decision. I think that, once again, FDR is to be lauded for taking a very hands-off approach to the military operations throughout this war as a whole. But this is one of the few cases where he really used his leverage as commander-in-chief to point out to people like Marshall that from a domestic political standpoint, it is absolutely imperative that I have American forces in action against the Germans this year. I could care less where that happens. It could have happened in the Azores, for all he cares. But I've got to be killing Germans to demonstrate to the American people that this war is moving ahead. And so that, in combination with the fact that, we can have all these debates and people like Gary Giamara have, very strong opinions about whether or not it was feasible from a technical standpoint and a logistical standpoint to go into Northern Europe in 42. The fundamental political reality remains that there is no possible world in which the British were going to let that happen. Just no. So given those constraints and given the British constraints and the American political imperatives, North Africa then becomes sort of the least evil option that's out there, and we throw together this operation, and boom, here we are in North Africa.
Yeah, and there's some comments there about it being Mr. Frickin' Torch was necessary as the remainder of the British Army in North Africa is too valuable to lose. Torch was needed to shorten shipping routes in the Middle East and Far East, blah, blah, blah. I agree with all of that. Yep. I also think we need Torch to iron out the fundamental differences in policy between the US and the UK. That, for me, is the worst time of the relationship between the two countries.
Yeah.
And although that's not the reason to launch an amphibious assault and an operation of that scale, but I think it does get all the elephants in the room are out there. Even the Casablanca conference later is when the Americans go in underprepared for that. The British kind of win that conference, I think, pretty much. And I think when you get to Italy and later to Overlord, we've gone through our absolute worst part of our relationship. So I worry that if there wasn't a Torch, those because it's all to do with empire and post-war aspirations and that those would have come later at a more important juncture and weakened something that was more crucial than Torch. I don't know with that. That makes sense with that.
No, I think that's right. I think that we have this very ambitious vision, particularly on the part of Eisenhower, that, we are going to run a truly joint military operation here where our troops are all going to be, Rick Green, learning how to fight together. And it's easy to say that, we're going to fight together. There's a ton of just little nuts and bolts that have to make that, happen. What's your joint doctrine going to be? How am I going to allocate air support? Our radios need to work on the same frequencies. Just all this stuff has got to be figured out, and it's really hard. So, I think Rick Atkinson in his Army at Dawn, which is a great book, he says that, France would have been a lousy place to be lousy in. North Africa is a great place to be lousy in. We got to learn how to do all this stuff. And the American Army in particular has just got to figure out what it's like to fight the Germans. And man, those early first experiences are ugly because nobody has a good first experience with the Wehrmacht. And they always just, hit you in the kisser.
It's
And
like
so,
losing your virginity. No one has a good
yeah,
experience losing your
right,
virginity. And
right.
Torch was at the Allies losing their virginity in terms of
Yeah, that's
amphibious
kind of
warfare.
it, you know.
Yeah, I mean,
So, yeah, North Africa was the perfect place to just hammer all that stuff out, you know. And fast forward then into 43 when we invade Sicily, a lot of these new practices are already becoming much more mature. Our amphibious warfare is by, you know, that landing already like the best in the world. So anyway.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. I think I know in my own life, I lose a month from the end of my life every time I read an article where it talks about Dieppe as being the big learning curve for D-Day and doesn't
No.
mention Torch. I just get so, I don't mind if they mention Dieppe and Torch, but they don't mention
Right.
Torch. I know that's a month of my life I've lost in just anger, just resentment, bitterness.
Just bitterness. No, I look at Torch and it's just breathtakingly audacious when you think about the fact that the American component of this effort is being thrown together in 2 months.
It's like our biggest commando raid, isn't it? It comes out of the same kind of school of, well, it's there. Let's just grab some ships and go. Yeah, let's do it. Yeah,
you know, that is infested with U-boats.
Yeah,
it's hair raising when you think about it. That we were willing to do that.
What the beach is like, I don't know. We'll find out when we get there. Yeah,
right. And oh, by the way, the surf in Casablanca only shuts down the beaches 4 days out of 5. I mean, holy crap! It's just talk about, you know, there were 2 real shoestring amphibious operations in this year that were fundamentally important to the outcome of the war. And one of them is here, Torch, and the other, of course, shoestring, as was nicknamed, is Guadalcanal, which likewise just gets thrown together, you know, in the space of 6 weeks. It's nutty. It's just nutty stuff.
Well, I'm trying to bring questions in that connect to what we've just been talking about, which my brain's going up and down checking things out. This is interesting when I think connecting to this relationships thing, because 42 is all about these first dates these countries are having with each other who haven't had to really work, you know, the blind date kind of thing. So how was the situation between the neutral countries in Europe with the Allies and the Axis, and how tense was the relations? Because that's an aspect that you can't talk about 42 without talking about Turkey and Spain and all those countries there that because they overlook the Mediterranean. Do you have an easy kind of response to relations? It's a massive great rabbit hole, isn't it?
No, that's a really good question. And next question, please. No, I don't have.
I realize it's a big one.
Yeah. No, what do I want to say? I will say that a neutral country not in Europe that often gets completely left out in the dark is Persia and Iran. And little known fact, the Iranian people suffer arguably the highest per capita percentage of their population killed during World War II of any nation in the war, even the Russians, even Belarusia, as a result of the northern half of the country being occupied by the Soviets, the southern half being occupied by the Brits, the railway network being taken over and used for lend-lease transportation. There is a famine that ends up hitting there that kills a quarter of the Iranian population, and nobody helps them, even though they are neutrals in this war. It's scandalous. And you can make arguments around the famine in Bengal. How much of that was the fault of the British Empire? How much of the Iranian famine likewise is the fault of the British Empire? Because there was a lot of privateering going on and black market stuff. And in the case of the Bengali famine, Rich Frank has pointed this out to me, that Bengal was relatively autonomous in terms of Indian administration at that point, and the Brits were being sort of hands-off about the whole thing. So there's a lot of nuance there, but the bottom line is that in British occupied and administered areas, 6 million civilians died in the course of the war. So that's ugly.
It
Anyway,
is. It's another reminder of just how shit the war is. I mean, we're having fun having this conversation, but
yeah,
it is a
yeah.
shit war. Anthony's been asking loads of questions. We're not going to get to many of them. This one, I think, is the pick of his question. No, hang on, that's not the one I was going to answer. Sorry, this one. What was one massive miscalculation, looking back on it, that you thought the Americans did during either the battle in Europe or the Pacific? So we're talking about 42. Is there one thing they really fuck up in 42? The British certainly have our things we fuck up that year, but is there an American one that's top of your list?
That's a great question. If I have to look at American military performance during that year, and I'm, casting just all over the globe, I'm looking at you, Douglas MacArthur, for overseeing 2 different disastrous military campaigns during the course of the year. The first being the defense of the Philippines, and in particular, Darlan deal. That was a very interesting point. No, I like the Darlan deal. That was a good deal. Anyway, back to MacArthur. MacArthur's defense of Luzon was pathetic, and it could have been a hell of a lot better. There is there's a toxic relationship going on before the war between MacArthur and, honestly, between Stimson. No, drumbeat was fine. King did well in that. In that, we start betting the ranch that maybe we're going to be able to defend the Philippines effectively, and we're going to pump B-17s in here, and that's going to deter the Japanese because the B-17 is a ship killer, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, none of that ends up materializing. MacArthur, of course, is, for his part, sending back this constant stream of happy press releases back to Washington. Things are going great. The Philippine army is coming up to speed. These guys are going to be really hot troops, yada, yada. And all of this is baloney. And so when the Japanese end up hitting him in the kisser, of course, the whole thing just folds up. And I will say that specifically from a tactical standpoint, his dispositions to defend Lingayen Gulf were pathetic, stupid. The guy just tactically didn't know what he was up against, and he had a real opportunity. We've got 2 battalions of Stuart tanks in Luzon. That's 100 vehicles, which by Pacific War, particularly early war standards, has a crap ton of armor. We've got a very well-trained Philippine division that could have used that armor, and there were a bunch of 75 millimeter armed half-tracks as well. So all the fixins were there to put together a couple of regimental-sized Kampfgruppen that could have counterattacked into Lingayen Gulf, because when Hama's 14th Army comes ashore, they are terribly disorganized. They lose a lot of their radios, and they say in their own histories that we were, we were in terrible form. If we'd been hit by a counterattack, we would have fallen apart. We could have knocked their lights out, just absolutely crushed them. And would that have saved the Philippines? Hell no. It doesn't change the operational equation of Japanese air and naval supremacy in that theater that was ironclad. I mean, the Philippines are going to go down. But what it could have done is really thrown a monkey wrench into the clockwork machinery that this whole Southern advance is based on. So MacArthur completely bollocks that. And then, of course, he bollockses the logistical arrangements retreating back into Bataan. That's all on him. He just absolutely screwed that up. Fast forward now to
tearing up his Christmas card to you. You know that, don't you? He was
I don't
about
care.
to post it. He's torn up now in anger.
So, and he walks out of that campaign with an unwarranted Medal of Honor as well. Just Jesus God. Anyway, then you get down to New Guinea, and he treats the Australians just scurrilously, casting aspersions on him that they were unwilling to fight and unable to fight. And then, of course, as soon as we get American troops in there in the form of 32nd Infantry Division, they are falling apart too as they try to put their first attacks into Bunagona. MacArthur never even goes and sees this battlefield. He just sends Eichelberger down there to fix the problem. And, God bless Eichelberger for being great. He does actually manage.
One of my favorites. One of my favorites.
I mean, he's really, really good. But yeah, I just think that MacArthur's performance during the 13 months in the scope of my book is just execratious. And if he had been anything other than extremely senior and also freighted with political dynamite that FDR wanted to keep at planetary remove, right? That had MacArthur been anything other than that, he would have been either cashiered or sent to run a training command for the rest of his miserable life. So.
Brilliant response. I don't feel we've talked enough about the Eastern Front, and it is obviously a massive part of 1942. So the Battle of Kharkov is obviously up there in May 42, but I also think about the Operation Typhoon running out of steam in January. Obviously, most people's frame of reference of when it all goes completely wrong in Eastern Front is Stalingrad, but I think it's before then. Do you have any kind of particular things 42 wise that you want to just reference in terms of the Eastern Front that you think are important?
Again, the thing that I find so interesting about 42 is just the resurrection of the Red Army as an effective fighting force. That, we already talked about the fact that there's just a lot of things happening behind the scenes and under the hood that are not immediately available or apparent to the outside observer. What the Stavka does in the 15-month time span from like July, August of 41 up until the fall of 42 is just, it's hair raising. They rip apart their org chart not once but twice in the course of also doing this fighting retreat in the face of the most competent army on the planet. So they come into the war with these big, huge mechanized corps, 30,000 guys and 1,000 tanks. They're completely unwieldy. They all get trashed during Barbarossa, and so they're like, well, Jesus, all of our unit commanders are really junior. They don't know how to operate a unit that big. So we're going to tear it all down to these little armored brigades, 20, 30, 50 tanks. But those brigades don't have the staying power in the field because they don't have a motor pool. They don't have a reconnaissance element. They don't have enough rifle troops to actually back them up, blah, 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 blah. So in the course of 42, they start reconstituting those brigades and forming them into first tank corps, and which are little demi divisions, 6,000 guys, and then later on into a new iteration of a mechanized corps, which is roughly equivalent to a German Panzer division in terms of arms. And then later in the year, of course, we're going to get tank armies, and one of those is going to feature 5th at the Battle of Stalingrad. They're doing a lot of things like their artillery park had completely fallen apart during Barbarossa, and they realized that their rifle division commanders just didn't know how to coordinate artillery and infantry attacks were the crap. And so what they do is they take all of the heavy barrels, or the majority of them, away from these divisional commanders, the 122s and the 152s, and they move them up the food chain and put them into Stavka-controlled regiments at both the army and the front level that are going to be wielded by Voronov's artillery specialists and used to put together better coordinated fire plans for their infantry attacks. They realize that their rifle brigades have way too many rifles and they don't have enough bullets coming out of the end of them. And so if you look at the composition of a 1941 rifle division versus a 42 rifle division, it's the same 11,000 troops, but now there's 2,000 more submachine guns, and they've doubled the complement of light and heavy machine guns in that unit as well. So now these units, not only that, but they've also been beefed up with a lot more 76 millimeter divisional guns as well. And so that rifle division now is a lot less about rifles. It's got a lot more organic firepower, and it can at least reasonably defend itself against a German tank attack too, because I've got enough of these 76.2 guns. So there's just all this stuff going on, reorganizing. They resurrect the deep battle doctrine that, Tukhachevsky had pioneered back in the middle 30s. All of this stuff starts slowly, very unevenly coming together. But by the time you get to Operation Uranus around, in the middle of November, this is a different army. This is a different animal. They can actually win a war of maneuver against the Wehrmacht at this point, and that was not the case at the Battle of Moscow. They were paying 6, 7, 10 for 1 in terms of casualties. Now it's down to a mere 3 or 4 to 1, but that's an operable model to getting to Berlin. If that package of military improvements doesn't come together, do I think the Soviets are going to win? Yeah, probably. Are they going to win on the time scale that they ended up winning on? No way in hell. It's a completely different war.
No, I think I'm glad you mentioned that, and I think we talked about it already. The 42 as being the the investment year, both financially, but also in the systems that are going to develop and come into fruition later on. It's such a it's a bridging year in so many ways. We've got a great question from JD at History Underground. Other than the Selective Training and Service Act, what else is the US doing pre-Pearl Harbor that gives them forward momentum into 1942?
Well, there's a lot there. Obviously, from my standpoint as a naval historian, the Two Ocean Navy Act of July 1940, that's just enormous. That you've allocated the money for the core of what is going to be your 1944 fleet. Those keels have been laid, baby. And just the sheer staggering size of that allocation is like $18 billion or something, which back in the day was real money. So if you're Nimitz then in 1942, the Pacific is a dumpster fire right now, but I know for sure that if I can just hold on and keep my losses to a reasonable minimum, that by the end of 1943, American industry is going to hand to me an absolutely unchallengeable writ of naval supremacy in this war. I'm just, I'm going to be able to crush the Japanese Navy. I just got to hang on to that time. The other big one from the naval side that I would talk about is just the amount of money that we dumped into merchant shipping. The amount of money that we put in to sort of jumpstart the whole Liberty Ship program.
Well, before you go too far with that, Sal asked that a minute ago, how crucial was the role of Emery Land, the head of the U.S. Maritime Commission, in ramping up construction of Liberty ships?
Sam, so nice to see you again. Absolutely crucial. Emery Land is a badass, and he knows what he's doing. I think that I could look this up real time as well, but the bottom line is we pumped in something on the order of $3 billion to jumpstart that merchant ship building program, which again is an enormous sum of money. And if you look at that amount of money, I think it's something on the order of 5 times more money than the Japanese were spending building naval vessels. And we're spending that on cargo ships. Holy Magilla. So, a lot of those programs were already in place at this point and are being geared up, and that is going to give us the logistical largesse, or at least capability. There was never largesse. I mean, we were always short of shipping throughout the entire freaking war, but we would have really been in deep weeds if we had not gotten Emery Land's program off there.
Brilliant. We're hopping about the subjects again. Gary August is asking, what significant decisions were made to the air campaign in 1942? Now, there's another great massive rabbit hole. How long have we got? Which country, which theater? But anything that leaps to your mind?
Well, I'm not a huge Arthur Harris fan, but I think you have to give him pretty high marks for reinvigorating Bomber Command and at least focusing it on a mission that it was capable of performing, i.e. burning down entire German cities, and then, doing that thing with this sort of monomaniacal focus. And Harris comes into a command that is just in tatters. In many cases in these early year raids, the British would lose more bombers than they killed in terms of civilians on the ground. So I'd kill, 7 Germans and lose 10 planes with, probably 60 aviators as the cost of doing business. The Bomber Command under Richard Pierce was a failing model. It was clear that it was just not working. And so putting Harris in charge of this force right after the British had also made the decision that we are moving to area bombing and dehousing. This is just how we're going to do business. Those were big changes. Harris then realizes I've got to find some sort of a spectacular operation that is going to allow me to tamp down the internal dissenters in Parliament that are pointing fingers and saying the bomber campaign is just not worth the blood and treasure that we are expending on it at this point. And that results, of course, in the 1,000 Plate Rain. 100,000 plane raid against Cologne, which is just a huge PR coup for Harris. At that point, in essence, he has now won that debate, and he's going to get the bomber force that he hopes for, down the line. As far as the Americans are concerned, of course, we don't really run much in the way of combat operations this year because it takes, a good 8 months to start setting up shop for 8th Air Force in Britain. You got to move all this stuff over. You got to build all the air bases, which the British are already in the process of doing at the beginning of the year. Thank you, Great Britain, for expending 155 million pounds and 40,000 acres worth of farmland, and turning that over to us. God bless you. So we then come in and put together this Air Force. But the thing that I would say in terms of decisions that were made in that air campaign, as far as the Americans are concerned, they come into this campaign with a very clear-cut vision of what it is they want their Air Force to do. We've written Air War Plan Division 1. We have a rough outline of the number of aircraft that we think we are going to need in this theater. We are totally dedicated to this notion of precision daylight bombing, and we are absolutely determined to prove whether or not it is going to work, and we're certain it is. And I'll be a contrarian here, and I will argue that actually it did work, that even in the dark days of 1943, it was working. And the reason I'll make that argument is on the basis of loss percentages. During the year 1942, which was statistically the most dangerous year to be a bomber command aviator, the average operational loss rate was 4.9% over the course of that year, which is just awful. So bad. There were only 2 months during the entire war when 8th Air Force met or exceeded that number, and it is August and October of 1943 in the course of doing some of those raids against Schweinfurt and so forth. Mm-hmm. So, I think a lot of people look back at the bomber campaign in 43, 44 and say, well, were it not for the advent of the Mustang, the American Bomber Command would not have worked. I don't think that's true. I think that the pipeline was there, that if we had to sustain that level of attrition, we absolutely could have done it. It would have meant a lot more downed American bombers and dead American aviators. But at no time in the war was 8th Air Force ever paying the operational tax that Bomber Command shouldered the entire war. During the war as a whole, our operational losses were 40% lower than the British, even though the British were flying at night, 2.7 versus 1.7%. So daylight precision bombing worked, broadly speaking. It's just that at the end of the day, by the time you get to the end of 1943, 8th Air Force is like, well, all the trend lines are going absolutely pear-shaped, and we hate this. And you know what? We now have the ability to flip the table and just change the game completely. And the way to do that is crush the Luftwaffe. And that's what we set out to do. And by the time you get to April of 1944, we've won that battle. So sorry, we got way down the road.
It's good. I mean, and with the British Bomber Command in 42, again, it kind of connects with that commando raids. We've got to do something. We've got to do something, even if it isn't working. We've got to take the war somehow to the enemy, and even though it's not having the results anybody wants, and it's causing lots of life,
it's awful.
What are the alternatives? That's that. But talking of alternatives, a couple of questions coming up about. We talked about last time, the Germany first aspect. So Dave is saying, when do we go to war? We, meaning the USA in this case, with Germany if Hitler doesn't declare war on the US. And World War II analysed, given the certainty of US Navy superiority from the Navy Act, wasn't it unnecessary, unwise to divert so much to the Pacific in 42, like we were going to win anyway? Germany was more urgent and risky. So
great questions. Let's go back to the first one. Flip back to the first. Okay. Early 1942, we're going to be a shooting war with the Germans in early 1942 because Donitz and Hitler are both really pissed off with this whole business of the Americans basically claiming half of the Atlantic Ocean and saying, we're neutral, we own this, you can't really mess with us. They've already sunk one of our destroyers. They sank the Reuben James, right? Yeah. That would have been a casus belli if we had wanted it right then and there. So it's clear that this is kind of a phony war already going on, that we claim that we're neutral, but we're not neutral. Everybody knows that we're not neutral. And the Germans I think rightly, are like, we need to make the Americans actually fight for that claimed half of the Atlantic. And eventually there's going to be a war, just because we're going to lose another destroyer or some goddamn thing is going to happen and we're going to be in a shooting war. So that's the answer to that, I think. Next question, which was a great one.
Yeah, that's about the diversion. Were the US sending too much to the Pacific in 42?
I absolutely think that the diversion of materiel to the Pacific at that point in the war was necessary. And that if you look at what would have happened if we had had a couple more American divisions sitting in Britain, really what were they going to do that would have affected the war as profoundly as the Guadalcanal campaign ended up affecting it? That I look at King's decisions within the context of the first half of this year, and I think that King is months ahead of all of his contemporaries in understanding, first of all, that the U.S. is going to have the industrial and military moxie this year to fight a multi-front war. And two, that the unanticipated scope of the Japanese initial onslaught, which had just been, holy cats, much, much more successful than anybody thought it was going to be, that if we don't get busy and start, knocking the Japanese back and taking the war to them, that allows them the time to dig in and fortify. We're not going to get to Tokyo until the 1950s. That's unacceptable. Mm-hmm. And so it was absolutely necessary from King's standpoint, and I think it is absolutely correct. We have to seize the initiative from the Japanese and put them on the defensive and start turning this into the sort of war that we need to create. And the only way that we're able to do that, again, Guadalcanal, in my opinion, is the decisive campaign in the Pacific during this year and really during the war. And the only reason that we are able to undertake that campaign is because at the beginning of this war, we're taking regimental combat teams and plunking them down in places that nobody could have found on a map 6 months ago. Noumea and Fiji and Tonga and down into Australia. I mean, we're securing this supply line that runs from the West Coast down to Australia. And without bases like New Caledonia to use as a logistical springboard to go into Guadalcanal, we can't run that campaign. So we're really fighting fires at the beginning of 1942, and we're putting these infantry formations all over the place. But that was a very good expenditure of materiel in the context of that war, because it allows us to create the Guadalcanal campaign, which in turn is absolutely decisive to the broader course of the Pacific War.
Brilliant response, and I think that there's some people agreeing with you about your comparison of the 8th Air Force and Bomber Command. Also, some disagreement there, but of course, it's a massive, great subject. But a representative response is that comparing just the statistics isn't necessarily looking at whether strategic bombing is working as a concept overall, which is what you were saying, isn't it?
Yeah, totally fair. All I'm saying is that from the standpoint of losses and sustainability, the U.S. had the ability to shoulder those losses had they been willing to do so. We weren't willing to do so. We were like, and this actually rolls all the way back to the 1942 airplane, AWPD-1, which there's a real schism here between these two air forces, between the Royal Air Force and the American Air Force. The Royal Air Force was never equipped to carry the air war into Germany. They never had a vision of, we are going to defeat the Luftwaffe. That's not what they were in business to do. The Americans come into this war from the outset with this notion that the Army Air Forces are in this war. Yes, if we can win the war independently, but through bombing, we're going to do that. But we do recognize that we are part of a larger combined air-land team, and that our role will at some point be the preparation of the battlefield to get an American army onto the continent. And so as part of that battlefield preparation task, we must be prepared to go to battle with our opposite number, the Luftwaffe, and destroy it. So that we come into this war from the outset with this notion that not only are we going to bomb Germany into ruin, we are going to destroy the Luftwaffe. That is job one from the outset. And so, that is a real difference of outlook in terms of these two air forces.
Brilliant. I want to mention Burma simply because we had a panel discussion on Sunday with John McManus, Rob Lyman, and Jack Bauscher about Burma in 44. But in 42, from an American perspective, I mean, although you're writing from a global perspective in the book, what's your feeling about Burma? Obviously, it's not a good year for the Allies.
No,
42
not a
Burma,
good year.
but anything that you want to particular thoughts about Burma?
No, that's a very important campaign because of its impact on nationalist China. When the Burma Road gets closed,
China,
it's done. You know, the nationalists are honestly, I think they're toast at that point, because without external aid of some fashion via a land route, because I'm sorry, flying, stuff over the hump is just, that's romper room stuff, man. You can't equip an army through air transport, not in 1944. That's not happening. We had to have the Burma Road. We didn't. And as soon as that road is captured, Chiang is in a world of hurt. And not only that, but Stilwell really mismanaged that campaign. He completely misunderstood the quality of the formations that he was up against. The Japanese forces under Aida, holy Moses, they ran a really good campaign there, right up there with Yamashita's campaign in Malaya. Stilwell comes in with this, racially prejudiced view that the Japanese are no good and they are ripe for a counterattack, and we're going to hit them in the kisser and it's all going to be great. And he pushes his Chinese divisions way too far out in front, and they just get manhandled. And the result is that Chiang loses the remaining 6 of his better quality divisions. He now has no ability to counterattack back in China. And he told Stilwell explicitly before he sent those units into battle, do not risk these units, draw the Japanese up country and then hit them with a counterattack. Do not shove these units all the way down to the south of Burma. This will not work. Chiang was right. Stilwell was wrong. Stilwell walks out of that campaign with basically a company worth of troops. He walked into that campaign with 130,000 Chinese soldiers, and most of them die. I mean, it's just, yeah. So Burma doesn't get the press in 1942 that a lot of other campaigns do, but it's ruinous for the Chinese government, and it's ruinous for the British in terms of ever being able to reassert any sort of colonial interest within Asia as a whole.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
A lot of it. Yeah, absolutely. And H.P. Wilmot is really good about pointing out the fact that something on the order of 50,000 Indian civilians who are trying to make their way back from, places like Rangoon and Mandalay die on the roads out to Imphal. And they were not protected by British soldiers. They were left to be raped and killed and murdered by, Burmese bandits and whatnot. It's a catastrophe. And, right there, you have ceded your right to rule. You did not protect the civilian population. And so, for the British, it's a real disaster. It's not as bad, I would say, as the Malaya campaign, which is just a true epic.
Yeah, not many high points there. No, really not.
And so many.
No heroic Dunkirks, unfortunately, in Malaya, really, that you can. Just
so many bad battles. I mean, Jitra is just terrible. Slim River, oh my God, so bad. It's just,
incredible bravery, but all to no end. But I'm not sure I completely agree with you about Guadalcanal being the most important battle, but if you include New Guinea, absolutely. And I think Chilla's making the point there. I think we should always be viewed in conjunction with New Guinea, Kokoda, Milne Bay. And that's how the Japanese saw it. The Japanese didn't separate those campaigns. Yes. That has been how historians did it. Aussies and Kiwis have written about New Guinea, and Americans have written about Guadalcanal. That's how it's been for pretty much since that campaign ended. And I think we've talked about it so often in this channel. To bring those two campaigns into one is essential to understand, because otherwise you're only looking at half of the movie series, so to speak.
Very much agree. Yeah, great counterpoint. Absolutely agreement. And I talk about that very phenomena that really It is the perspective in Rabaul that is the appropriate one to look at within the context of both of those campaigns, because from their standpoint in Rabaul, the Japanese are looking at these two things as this twin-headed monster that's just eating them alive. So yeah, great point.
We've got to an hour and 43 minutes without mentioning Rabaul, which is something. But a question of just I don't like what if questions, but I think this one's too good to avoid. Gary August, who runs the World War II TV fan page on Facebook, would a failure at Guadalcanal have diverted US resources away from the European theater?
Great question.
Because I mean, it's torture. It's back to torture again, isn't it?
Yeah, right. That's a really good question. I mean, I think you can slice it both ways. And first of all, I'm just going to say I don't have a crystal ball big enough to make a prognostication there. One line of argument is exactly what Gary says, that we would be okay. I guess we're going to focus on North Africa now. Another line of argument is to say, well, God damn it, we're going to double down against those nips, and because again, at the end of the day, the coin of the logistical realm in that theater is naval power. And we know that we are going to have sufficient naval power come 1943 to really start taking it to the Japanese. And so I think we certainly would have committed sufficient resources to guarantee the security of that supply line running to Australia. That was just absolutely non-negotiable. So if we lose at Guadalcanal, that means we're going to start digging in at New Caledonia. I'm here to tell you. But it certainly would have retarded our ability to generate the sort of up-tempo, attritional style war that we needed to found in the Pacific to start this process of grinding the Japanese military up so that we can start making our way into the Central Pacific.
Brilliant stuff.
Malta.
I'm realizing we haven't yet mentioned the Arctic convoys, but Malta, I think, is another thing. It's a great news. I haven't heard anything about Malta, and he had put a question earlier, Great Dominion, that I'm going to go back to. What does John have to say about the significance of the British Air Ministry keeping all the Spitfires in Britain until about March 42, despite the desperate need for advanced aircraft in places like Malta? So that's something. Malta, we kind of pull a victory out of the bag at the end of that with the convoy, but we kind of let that one go a bit. We meaning collectively. Yeah,
no, that's fair. And the other thing that ends up happening, of course, is Keith Park ends up being the air boss on Malta. I forget exactly when he comes in. I want to say like June or July, something like that. And he's a very different animal from the guy that he takes over from, in that he was like, first thing he says is, why don't we stop them from bombing us? And he starts pushing very aggressive fighter operations, first of all, against the incoming bomber formations, but eventually he's going to start, running fighter sweeps up to Sicily. So he's kind of a game changer. And you're absolutely right that being able to run in pedestal and get enough fuel and victuals and that kind of thing. I tend to think that Malta was not necessarily as on the edge of starvation as some accounts have made it out to be, but it's clear that with Malta out of business in terms of 10th submarine flotilla and the force that was of surface ships that was operating out of there, that really the Axis have control over the central Mediterranean for the majority of this year. And until we can resurrect Malta as an offensive base and start bringing that war back against particularly the Italian Navy, that's a real problem. So I do think you're absolutely right that keeping those late model Spitfires, they were screaming for those on Malta. They really needed them there. Because things like the Hurricane just were not going to get it done against a 109G or whatever it is they were running. So, but this kind of ties it back in really to that morale question we had earlier, in that you can see some logic about the
we can now see the benefit, with the benefit of hindsight, that the Germans weren't going to plan anything against Britain in 1942. So keeping Spitfires there to depend, now we go, well, we didn't need them, but it goes with that perception of how the North Battle of the Atlantic was going. It goes with the perception of the fact the bomber command are having losses, the commando raids that we're sending in are not always having many survivors, and so I can really see at the time why there's this phobia about, you know, protecting Britain. I mean, that's all we've got left. It's all we've got left now.
Right.
So
and all the manufacturing capacity is
manufacturing, the supplies,
which is why they're, you know, wanting American troops to be over here too, because again, British manpower is extremely thinly stretched at this point in time. And if you are sending your own divisions to places in the Middle East and of course the Far East, which turns into a dumpster fire at the beginning of the war, we need to backfill with American troops. So there was still a palpable sense of danger, at least during the first half of this year in the British Isles.
I feel like we're in Life of Brian when they're listing all the things the Romans have done for us, in that when you're talking about pivotal moments in 1942, all of us could be sitting in the pub and go, well, what about Rabaul? What about Tobruk? What about this? What about that? There are so many what-abouts that you can mention in 42 that we haven't even got anywhere near 2/3 of them in this conversation. But that's the very nature of that question. I think this subject is that a shit lot happens that year, and it's not happening in isolation. They're all affecting each other. All these plates are spinning, and when one falls off, it knocks the next one off. That has an effect. They're all running over there, but it means it's a fascinating year. A couple of more questions, and we will bring this incredible talk to an end. Is there one item from 1942 that you think came on board? I mean, I don't know. Jerry can.
No.
Is that 42, 43? But
okay. Most important item. That's a great question. Okay, yeah, because we're not dealing with turning points. Item, physical item. I think you could make a strong argument for the LST. I think we had the first prototype LSTs out. That's a pretty darned important item. And anything having to do with amphibious capability, I think is super important as far as the Americans are concerned. Looking down here, you know, the Sherman, blah blah blah. I'm gonna go with the LST. That's my edge pick. So
okay, but that's gonna just sidebar is gonna kick off with everybody's favorite gadget. Kevin gets, could John expand upon the impact of the Coast Guard in 1942? Another service that starts small and ends up massively significant, and probably 42 is its big regrowth, maybe.
And I just saw Trent Tolenko's comment too, that the Liberty ship, I mean, technically speaking, I think the Liberty ship had actually been first launched in 41, but you know, the advent of that is super important. Trent is absolutely right. Okay, Coast Guard. Totally overlooked. And yet, you know, these guys were getting shot at on the North Atlantic convoy runs. I would say that the big Treasury class Coast Guard cutters, of which we had 7, did yeoman's work in that war. They were big, long range, seaworthy vessels, probably a little larger than they needed to be, you know, bigger than a destroyer escort, but Escort Group A3, which had one of those Treasury class vessels in it, was, I think, acknowledged even by the Royal Navy as being one of the better American escort groups, and that was built on a core of Coast Guard sailors. So an important service. They do not get the props that they should, along with, frankly, the Merchant Marine as well. And this is certainly true in the case of the British, that, you know, being a merchant mariner in this war was very hard duty and very dangerous at this point in the war as well. So, you know, tip of the hat to that service as well.
Yeah, we had people saying penicillin. We had, what else did we have there? Hedgehog, Huff Duff was mentioned as well. All sorts of things coming in as a gadget. My last question, we talked, and this will be my last question. I've said that before, and it turns to the one, but this will be my last one. We talked about the Allies having these, if you send stuff to the Pacific, does it mean you can't send as much to the ETO? The British, if we send Spitfires to Malta, we haven't looked particularly at the Axis's decision making. So it's a what if question again, but I had it there earlier on. I can find it now. And where is it? Mad Cat, could the Germans units sent to North Africa have made a difference if used to save the 6th Army at Stalingrad? I mean, I've heard that one come up before. You know, the Germans, that we came up earlier. Is it, did the British need, or did Allies even need to do torch? But there's already a British army there. But what about the Axis? The Axis, they pile in more people there when it's not going to come out well.
Yeah, good point. And yeah, particularly in the wake of Torch, they're going to double down and we're going to create 5th Panzer Army. And, dudes, you're way over late, particularly you, Adolf, in making that strategic appraisal. But anyway, back to the question, which I think is a really interesting one. To my mind, Operation Uranus is important, but it is really not until the failure of Operation Wintergewitter on Christmas Eve, when Manstein's counteroffensive up to Stalingrad gets the lights kicked out of it by 2nd Guards Army. What would have happened if in Manstein's order of battle he had another 2 Panzer divisions and 90th Light? I mean, that would have effectively doubled his combat power, and he might have made it to Stalingrad. The counter to that is, okay, great, but Hitler doesn't want you to relieve 6th Army. He wants you to create a land corridor to keep Stalingrad in supply over the winter so that we can renew our offensive activities. That ain't going to work. So I tend to think that the Germans had the ability to make a more outsized contribution in the Mediterranean, that Panzer Army Africa was actually punching above its weight in terms of strategic impact, and it would have had less strategic impact had it been on the Eastern Front. But I also think that, having an extra corps, an armored corps, under Manstein hypothetically could have produced better results for Wintergewitter. And to me, the failure of Wintergewitter is a real eye-opener and does not get a lot of attention in that. Up until this point in the war, one of the abilities that the Germans have always had is that when they put in a set-piece counterattack, they just knock our lights out. They're really good at counterattacks. This is the first time, really, that the Germans, under Manstein, who's one of their luminaries, right, and he's not able to get it done against the Soviets. And when 2nd Guards Army weighs in on Christmas Eve and just kicks them all the way back to their starting line in the course of another couple days, that really tells you again that the transformation of the Red Army is now, I wouldn't say complete, but this is an entirely different animal than it had been a year prior. If Manstein can't get it done, this is a different war. So,
I think to bring things to a close, I think my reassessment of 42 is that it's the year where you could only have one. Like when I was a little kid, and my mum said, do you want a piece of chocolate or do you want some boiled sweets, as we call them in England? Yeah. You can only choose one or the other. Right. And your grandmother would let you have both because it's your granny, isn't it? And I think 42 is both sides. Yeah. We can't do both. It's always by 44, we're like, should we do the south of France or Normandy, or should we? Well, we'll do both, and we'll do this one as well. And I think
the Marianas,
and I think the Germans and Japanese are kind of doing that in 41. They're like, well, why not just do both? But right. By 42, all sides are restricted. They've got lots of ideas, but they have to make these decisions between this or this. You can't do both. And I think that gives us as historians this ability to do so many of these what ifs, because as you said, that if they'd had 2 more divisions there, if they'd sent the Spitfires to Malta, if they'd hadn't done Doolittle Raid and they'd sent more 2 carriers to there, and it's that possibility of 42.
Yeah. I think that's absolutely right. Yeah,
it's so fascinating.
It's wide open for that. I just wanted to give a shout out to your audience for just such interesting commentary running along here, and
It's
really
amazing.
great
I've been trying to read
questions.
it and listen to you. It's difficult.
It's,
Yeah.
it's just always really fun to come on this channel and just get these great questions. So, gold star for the channel, gold star for the audience. You guys are great.
Yeah, thank you. The only annoying thing is I don't feel we've actually kind of wrapped up 42 and put it on a shelf. We've just opened up more.
There are things, I would love to dive sometime into a broader expansion on the Malayan campaign, which I just find infinitely interesting. And another battle that I don't think it's a lot of talk in this year that I'm particularly fond of is the Battle of the Barents Sea. Where Bob Burnett, puts paid to Lutzow and Hipper that has enormous knock-on effects in the Kriegsmarine. So there's just all sorts of fun
we could
things.
definitely get a Malaya one done, because Professor Brian Farrell, a Canadian who teaches out there, would definitely be up there. Ross Cable, who was a colonel in the Australian Special Forces, he's been out there. Someone would have to get up at stupid o'clock because of the time differences, though. But we could definitely have a panel discussion, but someone would have to be up at a stupid time. But that would be fantastic. But John, right now, I'm going to say this has been fantastic, as it always is. Great views.
Yeah, so much fun.
I just want to do it again. It's that, going back to that virginity thing. I've now done it once. I want to do it again. This is
you say that now.
I say that now. So this has been absolutely delightful talking to you. So, folks, we're back looking at the Battle of Monte Cassino tomorrow. We've got Rona Simmons coming on talking about the Battle of the Philippine Sea and the worst day in American naval history, or losses in World War II, which is October the 24th, 44, isn't it? I think. So we'll do that later this week. So, as always, check out people's book websites, sign up for everybody's mailing lists, buy their books. Consider becoming a patron, consider becoming a member, but I will see you all again tomorrow. Cheers, everybody. Bye.